was supposed to be a honeymoon period. The first 100 days. It now turns out that Keir Starmer is the least popular leader after 100 days, having gone into that election the most popular by a mile. How would you grade the Labour Party? A, B, C, D minus?
Well, I think in terms of how they've handled the last 100 days, could do better. I mean, you know, they won an impressive outcome in terms of the general election, although the share of the vote, let's be honest, was not as high as they wanted. But I think of, you know, what's been revealed and is concerning is that given all their planning to win the general election, you might have thought that the 100 days would be pretty well planned as well. But they started off with that announcement about the winter fuel payment, which has run every single day ever since. We've had the freebies situation as well, and then we've had this sort of, you know, battle in number 10 between Sue Gray and others, briefing. That's not the honeymoon that you want, and it's been self-inflicted.
So your view is they just simply weren't adequately prepared for government?
I think they just hadn't really thought through. I think they're prepared for government. I think they've got lots of policies and good ideas, some of it to do with employment rights that you've just highlighted. The problem is these other things, the winter fuel payment, the freebies, the, you know, people at loggerheads in number 10, they have distracted. And I think also, Rob, one of the things is that because the general election was in July, we've only had just over 20 days of Parliament sitting. So there's been a lot of recess time. And if you're not filling the airways and filling the newspapers with stories of announcements that you're doing, these other factors will take hold and dominate.
There's a management of narrative that might do. Having said that, though, when you look at some of the figures, winter fuel payments, the question was asked, do you think it should be available to all pensioners? Probably unsurprisingly, 61% of people said yes, because who's going to answer that question no? You know, unless you are somebody that's thinking we have a problem, we've got to fill a hole, let's look into awful details in the way that any government of any political colour would have to. Normal people aren't going to want to take that away. The other thing that I think is concerning is that even bigger percentage of people are upset by the gifts and freebies, which makes me think that this government has a massive problem with trust now because of that, which is going to impact the reception of the budget and the reception ongoing, and doesn't really go, does it, Salma?
No, it doesn't. And to be fair, this is the same problem that the Conservatives, you know, had to deal with when Boris Johnson was in charge. The difficulty for Keir Starmer is that he set himself against that. He set himself as the antidote to that kind of thing, which is, I think, compounds that trust issues, that you said you were going to be different, and actually it feels like you're the same. And I think what they're not going to be able to get away from is it's more of the same, you're all the same, and how are you actually speaking in our interest? And that's going to be a really hard thing to turn around, if ever being able to turn that around.
So do you think that was a politics with a small p, a bad handling, a being in opposition too long and being the one on the attack, are not thinking about how, you know, parties and groups that want to attack you might take up things? Or is it just stupidity?
I think it's ignorance. But I also think that it's kind of, you can do the holier-than-thou piece for so long until actually you realise that you haven't been great.
If you take the moral high ground, you have to be on the high ground. And look, I think that it's quite obvious how the public feel about these freebies. I think some of the other things that have happened, to be honest, under the Conservative administration are on a different path. The selling of the PPE contracts, all of that's going to come out in the inquiry.
Problem
but the truth
is, it's merged.
Yeah, but the thing is, in the public's eye, it doesn't matter if it's for 200 quid or 1,000 quid. They don't like it. Now, look, it is the first just 100 days. It's probably not what the government wanted of Keir Starmer. But you know what? They've got 4 years. This budget will have to have, and obviously everyone's filling the space with that about what they're going to do, there has to be some good announcements out of that allow MPs, Labour MPs, to champion those ideas.
It's unlikely.
And that's what they'll need.
It's unlikely you're going to get good announcements
when
you know, Rachel Reeves is trying to find more than 25 billion more in tax rises.
Totally, but they have to, of course. But at the same time, if she's going to have tax increases, the ones she chooses will be really important. But also, what is the vision? What is the vision about how the country's going to grow? And she's got to have a narrative that speaks to that.
We were promised that narrative. We had them on before the election. It had all been prepared. Everything had been costed. In other words, they'd had time to get things together. And yet, we're in this situation where he's never been less popular and there's never been greater distrust in the government. I think it's really interesting. Just have a listen to this. This was Stephen Fry on Andrew Marr the other day.
I mean, the interesting thing is he is a Labour supporter. He supported Sir Keir Starmer. He even thought about standing as a Labour MP. You're talking about somebody that was signed up to this, and his first word was disastrous.
Look, it's not the honeymoon they wanted, and I think they'll be looking to how they can have a second honeymoon opportunity down the road. But, yeah, I mean, I think it's clear some mistakes have been made, and it's got in the way of some really important things that they have done, which I think should inspire some trust and confidence. I think the way the riots were handled, the way the courts stepped up into action, the clarity from the Prime Minister on that was really important. I think on the world stage, he's shown himself as a serious operator. But actually, as with anything, it's those other things that really people, attach to. And lots of people in the country won't really know much about the NATO summit or all these other things. What they'll be hearing is about the winter fuel payment and the freebies, and they've got to get beyond that. And they have put a line, they have put a marker down to say things will change, but they need something else that people can latch onto and say, yeah, that's speaking to me and my concerns. And
You're
that's
smiling,
Salma.
It's like you're smiling to go, I've heard all this before.
Well, the thing is, both Caroline and I...
Look, they're not at the dog end of a government.
We've been in government before.
To do something different.
So I think both of us are a bit like, yeah, been there, heard it, bought the T-shirt, sold the T-shirt. But I think the problem here is that, once that culture and that tone sets in, it is like turning an oil tanker around. And for this to have happened in their first 100 days, I think is pretty cataclysmic in terms of what's going to happen for the next year, 2 years. Because if Rachel Reeves, as you say, if she doesn't set the right parameters for that budget, it's done.
Well, we've got short memories in politics. When Thatcher first became Prime Minister, she was voted the most unpopular Prime Minister in history. Now, she was...
And the Falklands War, actually, was the tipping point that turned that round.
Unlucky with events, right, exactly. How do you see Keir turning this around?
Well, events do have an impact, and again, I think, it's interesting, if some of these other things we've been talking around about, the freebies and everything, hadn't been in play in such a way, people have been remembering how he handled the riots over the summer. They would have been thinking about some of those other things. These things have got in the way. So he has to restore trust, and that means they have to have some really sort of heavy-lifting ideas about how they're going to support people that people can relate to and identify with. And not only that, they've got to have, and the budget's important to this, but everything else they do over the next few months, they've got to have big announcements, big changes that their MPs can champion, because actually they're the ones on the benches who will be corralling behind the government to go out there in their constituencies and elsewhere and beat the drum for those issues.
Right. I mean, even in the case of the rioters, as you know, it wasn't met without criticism, two-tier Keir, etc. The fact that they were able to steer people through the justice system within days, yet we hear today people who are the victim of sexual violence, women, sometimes have to wait 2 to 5 years for justice if they ever receive it, right? Yeah,
well, of course. I mean, that's the thing. That is part of it in terms of people see how quickly the courts responded there, and they'll be saying, well, why are women waiting 3 years to see the person who is allegedly committed the crime against them, not coming to court? So, yeah, it's how do you handle these events? And it's complicated in government. And, again, they need to get the number 10 operations working better.
I think the problem here is we all know what needs to happen. The problem is they said that they knew what they were doing when they went in, and the fact is they don't. So I think,
you can't really win an election by standing up and saying, we've no idea what we're doing, we're going to make it up as we go along.
But so who would ever not say that? And it's, Rachel Reeves in the Treasury is always saying, well, I didn't know what I was inheriting, and there's a £22 billion black hole, which, as well, is a little bit, is kind of like, actually, the books were open. But if you've spent all that time...
some of the organisations, actually, the Budget Office Responsibility said that wasn't quite the case. They didn't know some of the things
I mean, I'll raise you the IFS on that one. But but the point is, if you say you've got a plan for government, but then your manifesto is really light on detail, but you won't say what you're going to set out in terms of taxation, and you're basically going to win an election on the fact that, let's face it, we weren't great in government at that point. If that is all it's based on, then it becomes a bit thin, and it becomes thin very quickly.
You also employ the best people, right? And you make common sense decisions. Right, Sue Gray, as a choice to be Chief of Staff, given her investigation into Boris. I mean, both of you, do you think that was a sensible idea? I mean, Blair came into government. He had people like your late husband, people who were doing the job, knew professionally how to deliver that work.
Yeah, Jonathan Powell,
precisely.
Alistair Campbell.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is a top-tier group of people that are leading the country, Caroline?
Well, I mean, I think they had their reason bringing Sue Gray in. I think the juxtaposition
What was
of her
the reason? Help us with the reason.
Well, I think they saw her as someone who did have long-standing understanding about how Whitehall works. I think part of it, though, was actually overshadowed by the fact it was seen that she was coming out of a civil service position to work for the Labour Party. And who would have thought that she would be gone within 100 days? But I think, again, you know, I hope, and you'll have Pat McFadden on later, they need to do some soul-searching about how the operations have been happening. I mean, she has, you know, been ripped to pieces, it seems to me, in terms of briefings against her. That is not the way to run things. And actually, that's a role for Keir Starmer to take a grip on that. Tony Blair, you know, when we came into power in 1997, we had promised to stay within the spending limits. That's echoed. We had actually, on one level, not a hugely heavy policy agenda. I remember our little pledge card and what have you. But it was actually about the machinery of government and making that work. And Number 10, having a grip on that was so important. And now Starmer's got to reboot that to make sure that the people he's chosen now, Morgan McSweeney and others, are doing the job they need to happen.
So Sue Gray is now envoy to the nations and regions, and Sir Keir Starmer hosts this first meeting of the Council of Nations and Regions, invited members, First Minister from Scotland, Northern Ireland and also Wales, and also 12 around the country. We don't even know if she's going to turn up, Sue Gray. It's a very odd situation for something that should be one of the positive things.
So I've sort of gone back and forward on this, actually. My first reaction was, turn up, Sue. Stand out there, proud,
Just
and
to be
turn
clear,
up.
she's definitely not going.
Yeah, and then
there's some argument about her negotiating her severance package because it's been reported that £170,000 a year isn't quite enough for her new role.
OK, well, I don't know about all of that, Rob, but my first thought was turn up. Then my second thought was, this is the first meeting of the devolved administrations nationally and in the regions. Again, the juxtaposition and just the timing, she might have been another distraction to that event. So maybe it's the best thing that she isn't there this weekend.
Well, why give her that job then?
Yeah. Well,
why give her that job as the piecemeal? Again, it feels like a bad decision.
The job of this summit is not about Sue Gray.
No,
it's about the Prime Minister.
But if you make Sue Gray, after the week that's been, the envoy to it, she says she's not going, you know, and the whole thing is already a mess.
It sounds quite petulant, doesn't it? And it sounds like it's, again, that thing that it's this internal Westminster squabble where actually the only thing that matters is how you're feeling about the people that are around you, not actually the nation.
No, what's really important about this summit, first of all, that it's happening, and maybe we're going to have a serious discussion around how the Westminster government can work with the devolved administrations and regional government. That's really important because actually we do need, beyond Whitehall, players playing their part to make things happen across the UK.
Well, I think the Prime Minister should make you Special Envoy to Nations and Regions because it seems like you're doing more about it today than Sue Gray is.
Oh, very, very cute, very cute, very cute. But I think, look, Sue Gray has actually, one of the things she has established is really good relations with actually the regional metro mayors, and they see her as someone supportive. So, look, she's not going to be there this weekend. It may be that actually that's best because it could be a distraction, and we're already talking about it, so it obviously is a distraction. But, you know let's see what happens.
You smiled just before when you were talking about the Blair government coming. Whatever your view of the Blair government, they were slick and professional. You know, you ask anybody across the political spectrum and they'll tell you. When it comes to this summit that they're having, right, you talked about Sue Gray having good relationships with the regional mayors. They've all been invited to this summit, the English ones. Nobody from Scotland, nobody from, Glasgow or Edinburgh has been invited to show up. That's sort of a basic cock-up, isn't it?
Look,
This is the moment I turn and look at the jury.
It's important these things are done in a way that is professional. And actually, my sort of rule, and I'm not saying I always got this right, because I made some, gaffes along the way, for sure. But, you know, part of the question is, I think, for anyone, and, you know, and this is the people around a Prime Minister as well, is asking yourself, have we covered all the bases? What's the worst thing that could happen here? What is this going to look like? What is our message that we do not want to have distraction? And actually, as a team, is everyone playing for that? And that's what they've got to get right here and have some grip on it. Because, as you say, there's, you know, there's good intentions here. It's important not to allow, you know, things like that to get in the way of things. And that's hard. And they're learning the hard way in this 100 days. In some ways, let's hope this is the sort of, you know, the 100 days that didn't quite create a honeymoon and we can move forward. They've got 4 years. We're not at the tail end of a government like Rishi Sunak was when he called the election. They've got 4 years to get this better and get this right.
We've got lots of health stories that directly affect, that answer Westminster people watching, which I want to get on to, but very briefly, because someone's looking way too happy. Shall we talk Tory leadership?
Yes, please! Yes!
The Tory Reform Group...
What's the polling on that?
Yeah, has declined to endorse either candidate. They say they've been consistently disappointed by the lack of engagement from the two candidates. They've tried to understand what they stand for and their approaches. What the heck?
Well, actually, I would probably... The Tory Reform Group, TRG as it's known, is probably where my wing of the party is, and so I would endorse that message. I think...
so you also are terribly disappointed with both candidates and don't want to endorse either?
I'm disappointed with some of the rhetoric that's coming out from the candidates, and I do not want, in the same way as with the government, I do not want this to be a Westminster sideshow where people aren't actually talking to the electorate at any point or understanding what the electorate wants.
Can you help us with what that rhetoric is that you're talking about? You're talking about a lurch to the right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, tell us, help us what that means, because, you know, there is a rule, just to be clear, that in the Conservative election party contest for leadership, they're not allowed to criticise each other, right? There's a rule about that. But there was a sort of backhanded comment that Robert Jenrick made about Kemi Badenoch about not wanting drama. And I think he was referring to how she acts on Twitter. Now, on any view, both of them have a presence in that space and in the public as right-wing candidates. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, but it's not just about
the
way that they interact with each other. I think the rhetoric on immigration, I think, is wrong, because we are basically going around in circles on the same points and topics that we weren't able to fully clarify when we were in government. And so we seem to be rerunning these arguments that we have already lost. We are also talking about culture war elements. And the more we do that, the less we talk about winter fuel payments, the less we talk about what's happening in the economy, the less we talk about business and growth, the more irrelevant we're going to become as a political force. And I find that really sad for a party that has such a strong historic tradition, that has been the greatest electoral force in the world, for it to be reduced in this way to this kind of bickering.
Well, just on how we've ended up here, I mean, these Conservative MPs who are saying we're not going to support anyone, well, they should have got their act together when they were deciding who to vote for, because they could have ended up with James Cleverly on the ballot. If you'd have been involved and you'd been there and been whipping the votes, you wouldn't have allowed that to happen. So I think, you know, they have created the situation where they've got these two candidates, and we shall see. And it'll be interesting to see just how the public view all this. Yeah.
Let's talk health, if we can. So, several stories that I think people will feel affected by. Waiting lists for routine treatment on the NHS has risen to 7.64 million, up £200,000, up £200,000, 200,000 on last month. And we're talking now about 300,000 patients nearly waiting longer than 52 weeks and 50,000 nearly cases waiting longer than 65 weeks. On any level, bad. On the front page of the Mail, there is a story which looks at a potential exodus from NHS because of pensions of doctors and staff. So one of the proposals that we're expecting might be in the budget, is that Labour is going to slash the tax-free amount that savers can withdraw from their pension pots. It becomes slightly complicated, but essentially a certain amount can be withdrawn. If people are close to retirement age, their pension pot, because that's the way people have been rewarded in public life, will be over that amount. So suddenly they're going to think, well, I better retire early because I have to take this lump sum and I'm just going to lose a chunk of it on tax. That doesn't feel, you were saying, talking about effective policy that's coming out of this to make people feel better because it's going to increase waiting lists and annoy doctors more and nurses.
Yeah, and if I remember rightly, the last government had to do a sort of rearguard action to reverse some of those things that had affected consultants and doctors' pensions to
get them back in,
exactly. And that's just a really good example of how, you know, it may not be obvious how these policy changes sort of permeate down through different working people's lives and has an impact. And, yeah, I know undoubtedly one of the big challenges, you know, going forward is, and obviously Wes Streeting has wanted to get, you know, more appointments, what have you. There's a story also about using capacity in the independent sector. But lots of these different policy things, you know, they do have an impact.
There's a big story about saying that the private hospitals will take up the slack. Now, of course, I think...
And, of course, some of those NHS people work in some of those areas as well.
Well, and also, more than that, that doesn't mean to say the private hospitals are suddenly being forced to give that treatment for free. That will mean the government has to negotiate to pay those private hospitals, and very often that's more than funding the NHS hospitals, isn't it?
Well, we, you know, again, just going back to the Labour government, we did utilise the independent sector. And as an MP, if I had someone coming to me who'd been waiting 2 years for a cataract operation and there was a clinic could do a relatively simple operation like that and get it done, I was 100% behind that. And I think what they're talking about, and you're right about, you know, the money and all this, where do we need to spend more, but also where do we need to be smarter about how we use the money in the NHS? How do we, for example, stop having beds taken up when those people, older people in particular, would love to be out of hospital, closer to home?
And then we come on to social care. Now, the front page of the Eye has a headline which I think will make many people think, thank goodness. Let's look at the detail. So it says, carers set for pay rise under the law. This is the Employment Rights Bill, which has been talked about in terms of, you know, paternity rights and various other rights and maybe more rights for the unions and sick pay. But this element looks like looking at a new adult social care negotiating body that can be an umbrella for the whole thing, for the whole sector, private and public. And it will give them a sense of a collective bargaining under law, which, of course, for many individual carers, individual agencies within social care, continuing care, all those cares, that there isn't anything that unites it, which is frustrating for those needing the care and those working within it. They've previously demanded, though, in this sector, £15 an hour for carers. But actually, that's significantly more than £12 an hour. And actually, we know that very often carers fall below minimum wage because their travel times aren't accounted for and all of those things. So is this going to be one of those things that looks good, but actually no one can afford?
Look, it's linked to that bigger issue around what every government's been talking about. It's so important, social care, but we don't hear much how it's all going to work out. We have a Department for Health and Social Care. Yeah. It's on the tin. We talk about an integrated health and social care service, but it is nowhere near there. No. And again, you know, the answer to some of these issues around older people and others being in hospital who need supported care outside, not necessarily in a residential care home, maybe from home as well, is where can we move the money to? Now, I don't think if we want, you know, decent care, and there's lots of decent carers out there working every day, that I don't believe that their pay reflects what they contribute and what they do. So, look, I personally think, you know, as someone who's a care worker, we're entrusting our loved ones with that person. Quite. $11.44 for the minimum wage, that's the minimum wage at the moment, is probably not enough. But it's the bigger question is, you know, how would that policy, which is one aspect of the social care dilemma, actually solve some of the problem for the long term?
And does collective bargaining make a difference?
Well, sometimes it does, but if you look at a lot of the pay review bodies for the public sector, you know, their asks can quite easily be dismissed and ignored by governments as well. So I think you've got to realise that actually the negotiating body can only act on your behalf. It doesn't mean it can get the results that you want. There's another aspect to this. Why do we think of care as so low-skilled? I think you redefining care as as a higher-skilled work would help some of this pay.
I have to say, to be honest, I don't think people do think of it as low-skilled. I think it's rewarded financially
as a low skill.
And so, therefore, you know, that's a problem. OK, crikey.
Precisely. Thank you both very much. Yeah, no, I hear your passion on that. My dad's carers are extraordinary.
Absolutely.
You know, undervalued and underpaid. And I don't think there'd be anybody out there that doesn't think that they're frankly worth more. But you have to have the professionalism and the forethought to pay for it, right?
Exactly.
And I think your view was, what, C- for the Labour government, Caroline?
Could do better.
Could do better.